that would be less efficient than having one firm. Right? So it will often be the case, and we'll study this as well later, that when a market is really small, it may only be able to support one firm. But as the market gets larger, it supports naturally more firms. Victor, Leo, could you give some examples of natural monopolies in practice?
The book talks about utilities.
Yep. Yeah, that's a good example. Electrical utilities, right? Another example is sort of like social or telephone networks. A lot of people think are, natural monopolies. It seems really hard to imagine there being a bunch of different social networks because everyone wants to be interconnected with everybody else. Another example is the monitoring. Yeah.
Oh, I was going to ask, did you say professional sports is a natural monopoly?
No, I didn't.
Oh, I mean, could you?
Could you? Well, I guess it depends what you mean by that. So a professional sports league is probably a natural monopoly, but each individual team is obviously not a monopoly, right? So to the extent that the league is organized, which is basically what it is now, you could say that they're a monopoly. They're also a monopsony, because basically the workers have nothing to do other than be basketball players. Like the next best job that most top basketball players could get would probably be like washing dishes in a restaurant or something. So another example of monopoly is monitoring income. So I don't know if anyone looked at the solutions to problem set 1, question 2, sort of towards the end, but the government basically owns an equity stake in every citizen, right? They get some chunk of our income, right? And there's a huge amount of economies of scale in doing that. It wouldn't make much sense to have a bunch of different companies that did the job of monitoring your income, because the problem is, like, one of the main ways I make sure that you don't cheat on your income taxes is that I also collect the income taxes from your employer, right? And I can check them against one another to make sure things line up. So it's just much more efficient to be checking everyone's income than it is for different companies to be checking different people's income. Public transportation is a natural monopoly in many settings.
Should it be a natural monopoly?
Well, natural monopoly means it should be, right? So I think it's a natural monopoly because the thing is the whole system has to link up with it. It would be quite inefficient to have a bunch of different systems which they couldn't link up very well. Yeah,
This back to the sports argument, you said that clearly the current leagues are monopolies, but are they natural monopolies?
well, I think they might be. I don't know. I mean, I'm not that confident of that conclusion. But it seems like if you had two different, basketball leagues, it might be quite a bit less efficient because you would lose out on the opportunity to have the absolute best people playing the other absolute best people within a given league. And if people value seeing the best people, then there's going to be a natural push to consolidate and have all those people playing against each other in one league.
Do natural monopolies have to be protected to?
No. They don't have to be protected.
Does that ruin it being a natural monopoly because of government, like there are antitrust laws
that help it?
Is that?
Yeah, I mean, the question is, it clearly is a monopoly. It's partly a monopoly because of government policy, possibly, or it might be that it's a natural monopoly and the government policy is redundant. I don't know. It's complicated. I mean, my intuition is it probably has some natural monopoly characteristics, but not as strong as some of these other examples. So the simplest solution to monopoly is just to mandate that the firm charge prices equal to marginal cost, right? The problem with this is typically marginal costs are below average costs because there's economies of scale. Like that's the nature of a natural monopoly, is that cost curves are declining, and that means that the marginal cost is below the average cost. And so what that means is that if we want firms to price at marginal cost, which is efficient, we'd have to provide a big subsidy to make sure the firm doesn't lose money. So this requires not just having a regulator in charge, but it requires the government actually supplying the money to make up for the losses made by the firm. And this has to come from taxes that you and I all pay, like income taxes, sales taxes, things like from the last lecture. So we talked about this lump sum redistribution last lecture. Well, one major form that takes is subsidies to natural monopolies so that they can operate at marginal cost prices. It's basically like a public good in that sense. So some examples of that are that public transportation usually makes losses. It charges prices that are close to marginal cost, but they have tons of fixed costs of upgrading the system and stuff like that, and that's just paid by the government. The Postal Service usually makes losses as well. Most government services, like the Department of Motor Vehicles, also make losses. So those are examples of things that you might think of as natural monopolies, where because they charge marginal cost prices, they make losses, and those are funded by the government. So two other ways, other than marginal cost pricing, have been proposed to achieve the optimal solution. One is perfect price discrimination, and Federico, can you remind us why that achieves the ideal, the optimal outcome?
Yes, because the firm would always want to supply everyone who has marginal willingness to pay, or willingness to pay marginal cost, but it can't because it would lose profit on the end for marginal units.
Yeah.
And if it can charge willingness to pay to every single customer, then it can supply everybody who's willing to pay above marginal cost.
Yeah, that's exactly right. So, so in practice, that doesn't work, as we talked about last lecture, or the lecture before, but there's lots of things that can get close. Nonlinear pricing, two-part tariffs, high quality, very well done third-degree price discrimination, and if this works well, it's really not that different from sort of an income tax, right? Because you try to figure out what everyone's willing to pay. If that's closely related to their income, you're sort of just charging them something based on their income. It's actually quite similar to some sort of an income tax. Another possible solution is subsidies in the absence of a price regulation. And Clementina, why could that solve the problem?
What could it solve?
Yeah, well, how could subsidies, even if we didn't have like a cap on prices, eliminate the distortions created by a monopoly?
Because it is if you didn't have this deciding less than people's prices, because they would have purchasing power, or if they want subsidies towards the companies, then they would increase the tax.
Yeah, that's right. So the company, basically the problem in a monopoly is that prices are above cost. The consumers create a positive externality for the firm. We can internalize that externality by giving them a subsidy that's equal to the markup, right? And, yeah.
In the INAF article, the
Yeah.
insurance one, it
Yeah.
said that another way of solving this would be to mandate every customer to buy insurance. And that would give it
Yeah, that's
optimal.
sort of like cap and trade.
But how would that? I don't understand how that would reach the optimal quantity, because the firms don't want to supply it. If you just tell customers you have to buy it. they
Well,
don't sell
then
it.
that's basically like giving a subsidy that they're sort of like now being taxed and forced to pay for their insurance. You see what I mean? So you could do a similar thing here. It's sort of like cap and trade, right? Imagine you said to consumers, rather than giving them a subsidy, a certain number of people have to buy the product, and then people would have a tradable
Right.
commitment to purchase the product, right? So subsidies create the same issue that the marginal cost pricing does, which is that they require general government revenue. And we'll talk some of the issues with that. So the only major difference between regulation and these two types of solutions is the distribution of resources, because under both subsidies and perfect price discrimination, all the things that are needed in order to make things more efficient end up being captured by the monopolist, right? The monopolist gets those subsidies. The monopolist gets to perfectly price discriminate. Whereas under regulation, that money is taken by the public. So in some sense, all these things are the same solution, except there's a question of whether the monopolist or whether the public gets the benefits associated with it. And if you want to take one of these solutions and then transfer the benefits to the public, you can hold an auction for the right to be the monopolist, and then you can use that money to pay for public services. Okay, so the problem is that all of these solutions require a ton of information. So marginal cost regulation requires you to know the entire cost curve, right? It's not enough to know just what the marginal cost is, because that lets you get the right level of prices, but you have to figure out how much of a subsidy to give the firm so they don't go bankrupt. You don't want to give them too much, but you don't want to give them too little, because if you do too little, they'll shut down. If you do too much, then you're just giving away money. And that requires that you know both the average cost and the marginal cost at every point. There's also basically negative incentive under this system to control costs. So anything that doesn't affect your marginal cost, just like wasting money on all types of stuff, even if as long as it has no effect on your marginal cost, won't affect the price. And so you can go and do whatever the hell you want as long as it shows up on your cost. So a classic example of this is like, I don't know if anyone has ever worked for like an investment bank during the summer, but if you start getting like an expense account, right, where like, anything that's a cost to them that's not a marginal cost for you, you just go and, get drunk and you charge it to entertainment expenses. In fact, we'll see in Margin Call, when we go to see that movie, there's this great line where they ask this guy how he spends $1.5 million a year, and he says he spends about $80,000 on hookers, drugs, and alcohol, but then most of that he can expense as a business expense. So it doesn't actually consume much of his income. So marginal cost pricing can give very little incentive to keep costs down. Pigouvian subsidies require knowing a fair bit about demand, right? You don't need to know the whole curve, but you do need to know its slope over a range to know what the firm's optimal markup is, right? Perfect price discrimination requires knowing each person's individual willingness to pay. And even extracting, once you've got Pigouvian subsidies or perfect price discrimination, the value to give back to the public by an auction requires that there are several other competitors who also know what the value of the franchise is. Otherwise, they won't bid aggressively for it. Another really important problem with this type of thing is that once you regulate things down to marginal cost, it's really hard to know whether it was worth creating the thing in the first place. Because the market doesn't tell you that anyone's willing to pay for those average costs, right? At least when prices are at or above average cost, you know that the demand in the market justifies the cost of creating the thing in the first place. Whereas if you charge prices at marginal cost, who knows? It could have just been a totally wasteful thing in the first place. And we'll talk about this a bit on Tuesday, but there's a famous quote from Adam Smith where he says, 250 years before Sarah Palin, that basically the problem with building bridges using the government revenue and then charging marginal cost for them is that then you end up building bridges over rivers that no one ever travels over, right? Because there's no discipline on it that makes sure that it's worth building the bridge in the first place. So another problem is what's called regulatory capture. Regulation can often become a means of corruption. The regulators end up being cozy with those who are regulated. They're easy to control. And just as with licensure that we talked about in the first class, consumers are very diffuse, right? Whereas the regulated firms are very concentrated. And there's some evidence that this happens, but organized consumer groups can sometimes help balance this type of thing. And the worst situations are when things are very opaque, when the industry is very complicated, when it's very hard for consumers to monitor anything. In some sense, this is really just the same as the information problems I was talking about, which is that consumers don't have enough information to really monitor effectively compared to what the people in the industry does. And maybe that pushes back who we want to think about having the information or not having the information one level, but in some sense it's fundamentally an information problem. So the key thing is putting people who have the right incentives and the right information in charge of the system in some way, as we've studied throughout the course. Yeah, Ben?
The last time I was talking about the information problems, and we were talking about how we were trying to build a railroad to go to a hill.
Yep.
We wouldn't know the right price, right?
Yeah.
So is there a way to think about this issue in terms of pricing things and that price revealing information?
Yeah. So the problem is that, as we'll see in many different ways in the upcoming lectures, there's this fundamental tension between marginal and average cost. because the price relevant to whether the thing should be created in the first place is some average cost. The price relevant to what the thing should be sold at is marginal cost. And we sort of can't get both of those things at the same time. And so we have sort of these two different things that have two different relevant prices, which different regimes do better at capturing each of, but we sort of can't get both. And that's sort of the fundamental problem that we face when we have these declining marginal cost industries. Okay, so to address some of these concerns in practice, what's used more often is average cost pricing. And by the way, we have midterm, we're going to do another eval here, so people can either grab it after or whenever and fill those out and give them to Michael and we'll turn them in at the end. So to address some of these concerns, it's more common that average rather than marginal cost pricing is used. This is often called rate of return or cost plus regulation because the utility is capped not literally to earn its average cost, but average cost plus some small profit, because that's thought to be necessary to incentivize people to invest in that industry. So it's basically costs, including the costs of capital. And this is meant to cover the natural return on the capital investment. A simple model of this would be to just cap prices at average cost. And we're going to talk about some of the costs that this has relative to marginal cost pricing. In fact, that'll be our main focus. But Matt, could you explain what some of the benefits of average cost pricing might be over marginal cost pricing?
Well, you mentioned that with you might have to provide a subsidy for marginal cost pricing, so you don't have to do that if you price.
That's a good point. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, so I think that's an important benefit. It helps politically and with some other issues. It's also often easier to measure a firm's average cost than it is to measure their marginal cost. So marginal cost, you really need to say, if you were to increase one unit, what would happen? Whereas average cost is just, if you can somehow account for all the costs that you've expended, that's enough, right? So that's much easier to figure out by auditing, whereas marginal cost requires much more careful understanding of exactly what you need in order to produce one more unit. You also only need to know the average cost at a single point. You don't need to know what it looks like all along the cost curve. And if consumers are willing to purchase the product at the average cost, enough to make, if you can raise a total amount of revenue that's equal to average cost, well then you know that the product was worth creating in the first place, right? Because the consumer is earning some surplus. So average cost pricing can lessen a lot of these informational concerns that we had. So average cost regulation is pretty common throughout the economy. And Shen, could you give just some examples of average cost regulation? Or cost rate of return regulation?
So you would require companies to operate at a level where there's some
That's right.
funding.
Yeah. But what's an example of that in the real world?
Transportation.
Usually transportation is not run that way. So some transportation things are. Probably the most common are those power, water, heat utilities. They're all run, there's some regulatory board that basically oversees them and makes sure that they lower their prices if they start making too much profits. And these boards in turn are overseen, and there's a question of how well they're overseen, but they're overseen by consumer boards. Public transit does have some of this. Some infrastructure, like bridges, are required to recoup their average costs. So that's why sometimes they charge quite a bit for the roads, even if it doesn't cost that much to maintain them. Telecommunications used to be regulated this way. So until the 1980s, basically AT&T wasn't allowed to make more than a very small profit. And it was actually a bit odd. What happened is that local loop services, prices were held down and a lot was charged for long distance. So I don't know if you guys are probably too young to remember. I'm almost too young to remember. But it used to be that long distance was just like massively more expensive than local calls. And that was because local calls were actually being subsidized by the higher prices on the national calls, and all of that was sort of held below a certain rate of profit. However, in the 1980s, the antitrust Division of the Justice Department brought a suit and got AT&T broken up and forced them to give access to the local loops to other competitors. And so now there's competition, except I don't know if anyone's been noticing that there's not actually that much competition anymore. So the industry sort of consolidated down to like, Verizon having like a 50% market share, AT&T having like a 30% market share, T-Mobile having like a 15% market share, Sprint having like 10%, and then there's a bunch of like small guys. And now AT&T wants to buy T-Mobile, so we may be heading back to that monopolistic market structure, which might be because these guys are, evil and trying to monopolize, or it might be because it really is a natural monopoly, and it was a mistake to break them up. So there's controversy over that. Other examples, which are broader, is some countries actually do this through the legal system. So in many countries, you can bring a lawsuit against a company if they're abusively pricing, or if they're pricing too much or making an excess of profit. This is true in Peru, and that's sort of effectively a way of doing average cost pricing through the legal system. Okay, so average cost pricing is pretty simple when there's just one price that you charge, but what if there's price discrimination, right? Should we disallow or allow firms to price discriminate? Well, the key question there is whether that increases or decreases social surplus, which is what we were talking about a week ago, right? But there's an even more subtle question. We might even be willing to allow it to reduce surplus by a little bit if it raises the profits of the firm. Because if it raises their profits, that means we can lower prices elsewhere, right? This is one reason why they let them charge so much on long distance, so that they could subsidize the local loop, right? And so the usual answer is that price discrimination either just increases surplus, or it increases profits enough without decreasing surplus too much. And so most of the time, regulated utilities do a ton of price discrimination. So like power, heat, and gas are just enormously discriminatory across different parts of the city. And it's really easy. It's incredibly hard for you to go get gas from somebody else in another part of the city if they're getting it at a lower rate. So that makes arbitrage very hard. So a lot of these services are highly discriminatory across districts, across incomes, across amounts that you purchase. They have some of the most sophisticated methods of price discrimination. And in fact, a lot of the modern theory of price discrimination, including that problem that I gave you, the second problem on the exam, which was, I guess, the bane of everybody's existence, was based on a report that was commissioned by the California Regulatory Board about how they could do better price discrimination. So multi-product pricing is another issue. So when you have a lot of different products, like the local service or the long-distance service, the ideal solution is to use what's called Ramsey pricing, which is basically just third-degree price discrimination. What you do is you charge higher prices on the things that are more inelastic, lower prices on the things that are more elastic, and you recoup costs that way. That achieves the minimum distortion for a given amount of profit that you need to raise. In practice, however, things look almost the opposite of that. So national service, long-distance service was highly elastic, actually. People have lots of alternatives to making a long-distance phone call. Local service is highly inelastic, it turns out. And yet we had opposite pricing because people thought that there was some sort of redistributive issue. Like the people who have to make a lot of long-distance calls are sort of rich, and so we should charge them a lot. Or something like that. And there's sort of a broader question that this raises, which is, we've been doing all this analysis of consumer surplus. We've been treating every consumer exactly the same. And then we did this stuff on redistribution, where it was all about getting money from one person to the other. So, a key question is, does it make sense for us, when thinking about consumer surplus, to treat every consumer the same? And we're not going to get into anything other than that, but it's something to just reflect on. Okay, so average cost pricing can also arise not just from an explicit government regulation, but also by sort of the natural operation of the market. So if anyone can come into an industry where we have free entry in the sense we talked about earlier on in the course, and remember what the conditions for that were, it were that there had to be a large number of equally able people who could manage a firm. They must have easy access to capital, and entering the firm doesn't require any special knowledge or thing that is really difficult to acquire. It can't be rocket science. And there can't be any explicit government barriers to entry. In those cases, anytime a firm is making a profit, they're going to attract someone else to enter. And that'll drive down the prices to the point where they're equal to average cost when there's no profit being made, right? That's what we talked about several weeks ago. And that basically leads to average cost pricing. So we can think of average cost pricing either as sort of a government method of regulation or as sort of something that naturally comes out of the market process. Yeah, David?
In this case, would there still be like a small amount of profit as a payment to the investors for their capital?
Yeah, it would be sort of similar to rate of return regulation, right? Yeah. So this arises in equilibrium without regulation, and in fact this is a very common assumption in a wide range of economic models. There's lots of reasons to think that it's actually pretty unrealistic because of some of these heterogeneity issues that I emphasized a lot in Lecture 5, but it often offers a useful benchmarking way of looking at things. And so in many cases, competition to get into an industry can mimic average cost pricing. Some, and I think this is a little bit of a crazy claim, but some have even claimed that without multiple firms trying to get into the industry, there can still be average cost pricing. Because any time a firm makes a profit, even if no other firm actually comes into the industry, the firm is so afraid of someone else coming in that they hold their prices down near the point where they're hardly making any profits so as not to attract anyone else in. This is called limit pricing, and this theory is called the theory of contestable markets, or contestability. This is a bit strange because it basically requires that the firm is so afraid of a competitor that they think that the competitor could sort of come in, grab their monopoly position, and make all the profits that the monopoly was making without being forced to face the competition from you, right? Because if you have a second competitor coming in, it's almost sure that he's not going to make as much profits as you were making if you're now competing against him, right? Yeah, David?
But if they push their costs down to average costs anyway, they're not doing any worse than they would with the new entrant. So.
Well, but the point is, if they had prices a bit above, the argument is that they would be scared to put their prices any above the average cost, because then they'd attract someone else in. And that's a bit implausible, because once that other guy gets in, he's still competing with you, who is still in the market, right? And so it doesn't really seem like you would make as much profits as you'd make.
Yeah, I mean, it seems like in both situations, if you push your cost down to average cost to deter an entrant,
that's true.
You're in the same situation as if the entrant actually came in and pushed your cost down.
That's another good point. Yeah. So why would you ever want to do that? I mean, it's not very. Well, yeah.
In a natural monopoly, if another competitor enters the market, it pushes up the average cost, total cost for everybody. So.
Yeah, that's another problem in these types of markets, right? Is that in some sense that's not, well, the idea of contestable markets is the other guy will undercut you, take all the business away from you, he'll be more efficient, and he'll gain the profit. But again, that's a pretty weird assumption to think would happen as well, right? So, also, this really assumes that there's no fixed costs of entry or exit, which is often implausible. And so I think, in general, this sort of contestability argument is implausible. However, to some extent, these may put limits on the profits that even a monopolist, unregulated, can earn. It's not that if they earn any profit, someone's going to come in, but they may be afraid of entry, and that may help hold down their profits. Especially when there are many people who could potentially enter, and entry is quick, easy, and easy to reverse. So if the new company comes in and it doesn't make very much profits, it has to be able to get out, right? Because otherwise it won't have an incentive to come in the first place, right? So I think one you could have given on the cloud question from the midterm was exactly related to this. Because the cloud, it used to be that to start a tech company, you had to like build a giant set of servers to serve all the people who would use your application. Now, if you host everything on the cloud, basically, if you've programmed the thing right, within a week you can be serving half the planet. Because you just rent it and it just all goes onto the cloud and propagates. And so that's made it much cheaper to enter and exit industries and really reduce the fixed cost of entry. So we should expect these type of contestability arguments to be much more relevant in something like the tech sector where the fixed costs have come down a lot than in other sectors. Okay, so why is marginal cost and average cost, marginal cost pricing more efficient than average cost pricing? Well, average costs are just not marginal costs, right? And marginal cost equals price is the efficiency condition, right? So when marginal cost, precisely when marginal cost pricing leads to losses, it's because the average cost is above the marginal cost, right? And thus, average cost pricing leads to a higher price than marginal cost pricing does, and therefore too little will be produced if the average cost prices are charged. This is not really dissimilar from a monopoly distortion, but it's not as extreme as a monopoly distortion. Because a monopolist always wants to earn positive profits, right? And so their prices will be above their average cost, so they will cause even more distortions. Whereas average cost pricing causes somewhat less in this case. And the wedge, the social loss, is the difference between the average cost and the marginal cost, right? And so we can calculate the losses just using the standard Harberger triangle, right? So the difference between average cost and marginal cost is the slope of average cost minus the negative of the slope of average cost times quantity, right? How do we know that? Does anyone want to remind us how we know that? Well, this was just the story about my wife, right? You know, the marginal cost drags the average cost, right? So if average cost is falling, that means the marginal cost is below the average cost, right? And so you'll notice this looks a heck of a lot like the monopoly distortion, right? Price is average revenue, and it was P prime times Q that was the monopoly distortion. And the adverse selection, the distortion from average cost pricing is average cost prime times Q. So in one case it's average revenue prime times Q, in the other case it's average cost prime times Q. And the marginal distortion caused by this is therefore proportional both to the size of the market and to the slope of the average cost curve. So if the average cost curve is flat, this doesn't cause a distortion. If the average cost curve is declining, then the prices are too high. If the average cost curve is increasing, then if you had average cost pricing, the prices would be too low. Right? So what this means is that natural monopolies could still be harmful if they price at average cost, even when the marginal cost is greater than the average cost. Because that would mean they actually would charge too low of a price. So if we're in a part where the marginal costs are actually increasing, then actually average cost regulation could lead the price to be too low rather than to be too high. Yeah?
Is this a situation of like positive selection?
Yeah, well, we'll get into that in the insurance market, but you can even just think of it in a normal regulated industry. We could... So if that's the average cost curve and we're operating somewhere like this, and the marginal cost is therefore somewhere like that, right? So it was... right? Then the optimal price would be here. But if we institute average cost regulation, then there's actually too much of the good consumed. Because the price is too low. Because the marginal, and that could still be a natural monopoly. So natural monopolies, just like the selection case, can also have cases where average cost pricing actually leads to too low of a price, rather than too high. So here's a graph of this. In the standard case, where there's too high of a price under average cost pricing because there's economies of scale all the way through, right? So the average cost curve here is this line. The marginal cost curve lies below it, right, because it's dragging it down. Social optimum would be where this white demand curve intersects the marginal cost curve, but the private optimum is where the demand curve intersects the average cost curve, where the equilibrium or slash average cost pricing. And so the distortion is this Harberger triangle, right? It's the area between the marginal cost and the demand, between the optimum and the equilibrium. Okay. So, at least as important of a problem with average cost pricing is the longer term incentives that it gives. Companies can very easily affect their costs in many situations by making efforts, say, to cut costs for workers, by innovating to make production processes more efficient, by choosing cheaper rather than more expensive ways of producing things. And the problem set basically asks you to look at why this causes problems for average cost pricing. So unless all of these can be monitored or controlled by the regulator, the problem is that under average cost pricing, the firm basically has no incentive to try to reduce its costs, right? Because if it's always forced to pay, if it never makes any profits, right, then by reducing its costs, it doesn't make any more profits, right? So that can be very inefficient, and again, you'll look at that in the problem set. One particularly extreme example of this is that imagine that your regulator learns about what your costs are from what your costs are this year, right? So a classic example of this is budgeting by, places within the federal government. My father once worked okay, so let me explain the effect first. So if they're learning about this, you're going to have a giant incentive to try to make your costs look big, because then you'll get a big budget in the future years, right? And so this happens a lot with government agencies. So my father was working for a defense contractor, and they made a proposal to some general in the Army to design some weapon system, and they were like 50% under budget. And the guy said to him, I like your proposal, but I would absolutely be neglecting my duty to this nation if I spent 1 penny less than the budget that was allocated for this, right? Because he knew that if he spent 1 penny less than the budget that was allocated, next year they would have half the budget, right? And so this quite often happens. It's called the ratchet effect. And that's another problem that's created by average cost pricing, right? And that is true of all the other reasons why average cost pricing occurs. It's not just true of regulation. So when a company innovates, if it doesn't make any additional profits because of that, because everything gets driven to average cost, they have no incentive to innovate, right? And that's exactly what we're going to be talking about on Tuesday. Okay, so one important source of nonlinear costs is selection. By nonlinear costs, I mean a downward sloping or upward sloping marginal cost curve, right? We talked about this in lecture 3, but let's go back through the idea again. Let's let Q be the fraction of the population covered with, let's say, health insurance, or given a loan, or anything else where different people have different costs of being covered. And P is the prevailing price, right? And the reason why costs are nonlinear in this situation is that different people have different amount of risk. So under adverse selection, the first people to enter the market are the riskiest, right? So the first people to buy insurance, even at a high price, are the people who are really expensive to cover. And the people who buy it as the price comes down are the ones who are less sick. And Stieg, what does that imply about the slope of the marginal and average cost curves?
Yes, slope should be somewhat downward sloping because the cost is highest at the first because it's the people that are adversely selecting will come in first.
Yeah, that's exactly right. So the marginal and average cost curves slope downward. On the other hand, we can think of advantageous selection as being a case where, say, the most risk-averse or the most educated or the most health-conscious or the most concerned about their future people are the first ones to enter the market, right? So imagine, like, you're giving out loans, and the first people who want to get loans are the people who are most ambitious and, want to accomplish the most in their lives. And the later people are people who are less good. Yeah, Edward.
How often does it happen that you have advantageous selection?
More often than you'd think. So in fact, we'll look at some data. We'll look at some data a week from today, which indicates that in like subprime mortgages, it's basically advantageous selection. That like at the relatively high prices, only the people who are quite likely to pay do it, and then at lower prices, more people who are dangerous borrowers get into the market.
So like in the subprime like mortgage crisis, so like what happened then?
Well, I mean, it's complicated because this data comes from auto loans, but you might think that because there was so much credit available, it was starting to be offered to people who couldn't really repay, right? And so that's a classic example of advantageous selection, right? When it was only being offered to a few people, those people were likely to repay. When it gets offered to more people, then those people are less likely to repay, right? So that's a good example of advantageous selection. So, Alex, what slope do the curves have if there's advantageous selection?
It'll just be the opposite.
Yeah, they just slope. They slope upward, right? Another example of advantageous selection that I think is quite important is like often uneducated people or people who aren't very health conscious aren't interested in insurance. They sort of think they'll live forever or whatever. They just don't think about it very much. And those people also don't usually take very good care of their health, and so that can lead to advantageous selection in the insurance market. And also, there could be a mixture of this. These curves don't have to be monotone. They could be increasing and decreasing and so forth, so things could get quite complicated. So note that when we're talking about the cost curve here, this is not the cost curve of one individual firm. This is the cost curve of the market as a whole, right? This is the total cost to society of supplying the industry. Because insurance is sort of a social concern, we can think about the market in these terms of average and marginal cost. Yeah, David.
There's a debate around whether insurance companies should exclude pre-existing conditions from the pool that they cover. Is that related to trying to mitigate this advantageous selection?
Yeah, we're going to talk through that a little bit more in a bit, or adverse selection as well, right? Yeah, so we'll talk through that in a bit. So unless they discriminate in the way that David is suggesting, right, an insurer gets a representative sample of the population pretty much showing up to buy their insurance plan, right? And so in this case, if I'm an insurer thinking about coming in and offering something, I have to pay the average cost of covering people, not the marginal cost of covering the next person, right? So if I'm a small insurance company in a big industry, I'm just going to attract, a pretty representative group of people. And so what that means is that equilibrium with free entry is exactly average cost pricing, right? If I come in and offer my insurance, I'm going to pay the average cost, and I've got to cover those average costs, so I basically charge a price that's equal to that. So for exactly the same reasons, exactly the same as why regulating things to average cost causes inefficiencies, similarly, in equilibrium in the insurance market can cause inefficiencies, right? It's literally just the same as average cost pricing. When selection is advantageous, then there's going to be too much insurance, too many loans made, right? So the subprime thing could be seen as all of this, that there may have been too many loans made, but everyone was competing to get the few good borrowers, right? And in the process, they were making credit available to a lot of people who were very bad credit risks, right? When selection is adverse, there's too little insurance, right? because people are afraid that they're going to wind up with all the sick people that their competitors currently have. And one very extreme case of this is what's called a death spiral. So this is what a lot of people were fearing would be the case unless people were required under the new health law to purchase health care. Because the idea is that if you don't discriminate at all across people, the adverse selection could be very extreme. And in that case, what could happen is that, the price could start here, but then the average people who are willing to sign up at that price could be too costly to justify this price. That could raise the price. Then the people could become too costly again. That could raise the price more, and so forth, and you could just have the whole market collapse, right? Because as you raise the price and serve fewer people, you're serving a more costly population, and in principle, that could just spiral out of control. Another example of that type of thing is what's called Gresham's law, which was the idea that bad money drives out good. So in England, they had two types of coins, and either you couldn't distinguish between them very easily, or you were legally required to use both of the coins to be worth the same amount, which is sort of similar to what happens in the insurance market. You either can't tell whether the person is sick, or it's illegal to discriminate on the pre-existing conditions, right? And under those situations, what happened? Well, everyone hoarded the gold, the really high-quality gold money, and they traded in all the crappy money, because those two things were worth the same, even though they weren't really worth the same. And so everyone held on to the valuable stuff and wouldn't trade. And that sort of led all the good money to come out of the market. So that's the idea. Good money, bad money drives out good. So this was sort of the fundamental fear which justified a lot of the way that the new healthcare law was designed. And Bill, how could we draw a picture of the death spiral? So just to give you a little hint, remember what we kept saying is that no matter what the price is, the average cost of covering people is always higher than that, right? And that leads the price to rise again, right?
Why would it rise a second time?
Because the average cost is higher, right? So we charge this price, this many people come in, the average cost is higher. Well, people can't afford that, so they're going to raise the price higher, right? Because, I can't be charging a price below the cost of covering people, right? Otherwise, I'm going to go bankrupt if I'm an insurer.
Right.
Right.
So the price would just keep rising to a point.
So how would we draw that graphically, what I just described?
So your average total cost would sort of be exponential.
Well, it's always going to lie above your demand, right? Because the demand is the price at any given quantity.
Okay, true.
And the average cost, if it always lies above that demand, that's exactly the situation where you have a death spiral. Now, sometimes that's not so bad, because if the average cost is always above the demand, it might still, the market might, be, it might not be worth insuring anyone. But if the marginal cost is below the demand, but the average cost is above the demand, right, then it can be optimal to cover everyone, and yet not anyone gets covered. Yeah?
So when you said that this death spiral relates to the problems that you're talking about, that situation with the vendors and stuff, and when you charge a high
Yeah, exactly. It's the same thing.
Okay.
So that was exactly a death spiral situation. It was as we kept raising the tax, the people who were still willing to do to set up the stands were the people who were doing it in the worst parts of town, and so the whole thing collapses. Yeah.
So either everyone's covered or no one's covered under a death spiral situation.
Yeah, basically. So the problem is that when there are differences in risk, rather than in people's preferences for insurance, then basically all of the costs are just proportional to people's values, and you can end up with a situation where the average cost curve is everywhere above the marginal cost. So here's an example of the death spiral. If the average cost curve is above the marginal cost curve and the demand curve is in between them, then the social optimum would be to insure everybody, but the market will insure nobody, right? Because if we have these number of people, well then the price has to be this, but then and just kills off the market.
So is that why they want compulsory health insurance?
That was this graph is the argument behind the health law. However, we could also have advantageous selection, where things go in the opposite direction. So this is sort of the most extreme example of adverse selection, but we could also have advantageous selection. So if the marginal cost curve slopes up and the average cost curve slopes up, then there will actually be too much insurance, and we'll have this dead weight loss here. Okay. So, thus, to measure, basically, selection is exactly the slope of the cost curve, right? And the slope of the average cost is enough, because we know if we measure the slope of the average cost curve, that gives us the difference between the marginal and the average cost curve, right? And this is exactly the insight of Einov et al.'s 2010 paper. So they went to a large aluminum manufacturer, and they had them offer to different groups 2 plans. The first plan had essentially no health coverage. It was very, very low coverage. And the second plan had comprehensive coverage. And individual division managers had different prices for choosing the comprehensive over the more limited plan. And they claimed that this was basically random the way it was assigned, but it's actually a bit questionable that was really the case. But if it was randomly assigned to these different groups, that means different groups are facing different prices, right? And so we can just see what is the average cost of covering people when a different fraction of the population buys the coverage, right? And that'll let us exactly measure the average cost at different quantities, right? And this lets them literally just draw out the average cost curve, and then by taking its derivative, you can figure out where the marginal cost curve is, right? And this will tell us how much adverse selection distortion there is. But of course, the total size of the distortion depends on the demand function as well, because if the demand function is really flat, well, then there will be lots of underprovision. If the demand function is really steep, well, then there won't be too much underprovision. So here's what they did. Here are a bunch of division managers. Here are different prices were offered for the coverage. That led to different quantities. So here's when the price charge was this much, here's how much people demanded. When the price charge was this much, here's how many people demanded, et cetera, et cetera. Each one of those situations, right, for each one of these demand points, you can measure how much did it end up costing the insurer to insure those people. Because you can just audit the books of the insurer and see how much was claimed. And these are these dots right here, right? And then you can just draw, here's only 40% of people are covered, here's 70% of people are covered, a cost curve, which is just a line through those. And that tells you what the average costs of covering people are. Take the derivative of that and you can recover the marginal cost curve, right? And then they drew a demand curve through these as well. And then you have to find the equilibrium. So the equilibrium is where the average cost is equal to the demand. The social optimum is where the marginal cost is equal to the demand, which is down here. And the Harburger triangle is this area. Now, I think they cheated a little bit because this looks to me more like it's a concave demand curve than like a real one, than like a linear one. So I think it should intersect about here, so the area should be even smaller. But the basic point is that it actually is quite small in general. So they find that this is about this whole area of the Harburger triangle, much far, far, far from being a death spiral, right? To be a death spiral, this demand curve would have to go through the middle of this thing, right? Instead, the demand curve goes way above, and this area is actually quite small. So again, even though the adverse selection losses could in principle be large, it's really important to actually measure these things in practice, the same way Harburger did for the monopoly distortion, and figure out whether they actually are large in practice. Because, for example, a lot of things in the current health law were premised on the idea that adverse selection was a major problem. It may really not be that big of a problem, because some of these advantageous selection things can help offset it and so forth. the same types of approaches that we used to address the distortions caused by average cost pricing, the same sorts of things that helped us get towards marginal cost pricing, could in principle be used here to try to get away from the distortions caused by selection. So, for example, we could provide subsidies for getting more insurance. And does someone want to think about what some of the costs and benefits of that sort of a policy are? Just, they're very, yeah, Michael.
Benefits would be more people would be willing to get insurance.
Yeah.
Cost would be the big government or whatever.
Yeah, so all the problems that we had before with subsidies are going to appear here in exactly the same way, right? So anything that you say about, average cost pricing versus marginal cost pricing in regulating a natural monopoly applies to the insurance market pretty much. So while this is a widely advocated policy solution, it requires that we really know the cost function, because otherwise we don't know how much of a subsidy we give, right? We really need to measure the things that Einhard and Finkelstein, even them, who are these amazing people, had a hard time measuring. There could be a lot of capture of that system, because obviously insurance companies are going to have an incentive to say that there should be more of a subsidy. Anthony, how about mandates for universal coverage? What are some of the advantages and problems with that?
So mandates for universal coverage means that you say everyone has to get insurance.
Which is basically what the new health law in the U.S. has done, right?
Then that would basically be average cost pricing.
No, right? Because it's going to increase the coverage above the point where the market would provide, right?
Oh, yeah.
So like, look at the Einhard and Finkelstein graph. Average cost pricing only provides here. Universal coverage
Universal
provide
coverage
there.
provides there, but then like you would be having them operate at a point where the marginal,
Yeah, go on.
where how is that inefficient? Like you're making people who don't value insurance at all get insurance. So like
Yeah.
there's lots the other way.
So that's exactly right. So here's the market equilibrium. Here's the universal mandate. Here, what do we lose? We lose this little triangle and maybe even less than that. Maybe this little area in here.
On the other side, you lose that.
On the other side, you lose this giant area over here, right? So universal coverage is like a terrible policy in this, right? I mean, that doesn't mean that this is true or that this is true in the U.S. market. But I think there's a pretty strong case to be made that the U.S. policy was like hugely inefficient to like just mandate that everyone be covered. Yeah.
What type of people are going to be in that dead weight, that new dead weight?
Like who shouldn't be covered, you're saying? Well, I mean, here's the problem with covering everyone. When you cover people, they don't take care of their health as well, necessarily, right? And if people don't take care of their health as well, then that can be a real problem, and that can create real social costs.
Couldn't you argue that the people who are evaluating the health insurance don't really understand?
That's a good argument. So that if that argument is true, which I think is an important other argument, and in fact, I'm giving a problem set to the price theory students that's a bit related to that. If that's true, that's basically effectively another form of adverse selection. Because that's basically like the people who want to get the insurance actually generate this additional social, those who don't want to get the insurance also generate this additional social benefit associated with them getting the insurance. And you can think of that as like reducing, like an internality that reduces the real social cost of covering them or something like that. So if that's true, that could be a counter-argument. But if we went with this very classical thing where people never make mistakes, then this could be really wasteful. Yeah, Cody?
I was just going to say some people like that would be birth control. Now insurance companies are mandated to give, and that'll just increase price.
Yeah, I mean, that's another possibility. It has to do with the pricing of drugs. Like, when everybody's covered, everybody's like willing to pay a huge amount for drugs because the insurance company pays for it rather than them paying for it, and that could be wasteful. But Yeah, there's.
I was thinking like people like I'm young, like
Yeah.
oh why do I get, let's say I wasn't covered by my parents, like oh I'm healthy, I don't need for insurance, and then like
No, I'm with you, Ben. I mean, that's something we haven't even considering in the models, and a lot of these models don't consider that. There's one recent, we'll talk about this in a second actually, because it's going to come up in later slides, but it's a huge issue in healthcare. It's like how well people actually make decisions about these things, but we haven't been considering that so far. Yeah, David.
Is there any research on kind of the elasticity of taking care of yourself based on like how much you're insured?
There is, and in fact, there's someone coming to give a talk 2 weeks from yesterday about exactly that. Laurent Aynab, who we've been talking about in all these papers, is coming. Oh, and by the way, the guy coming on Monday is John Levin, who's like a co-author on a bunch of the empirical papers that I've been showing you guys, like the ones on the eBay stuff. So I definitely hope you'll come to his talk, and it's going to be a lot of fun. He's an absolutely brilliant guy, amazing guy. Similarly, we could have price discrimination. So Ben, how would that work in this type of context?
you charge people who are more likely to be sick a different price, or less likely to be sick a lower price.
Yeah, exactly. So much adverse selection happens because of lack of personalization, but this is very politically explosive, and it actually may be politically explosive for very good reasons. So a recent study by some of my friends found that it's a much bigger problem, actually, that people don't have long-term insurance. Like they can't buy insurance now against their health risks that they face for the rest of their life. And what that ends up meaning is that if I switch employers and have to get new insurance, the risk that I have that my rates might go up because of a pre-existing condition that I've acquired between now and then can be much worse than the actual medical risks I save by getting the insurance. So some of that pricing or not pricing is a way basically of society providing insurance against what's called reclassification risk rather than just against medical risk. And there's a trade-off between insurance on reclassification risk and insurance on medical risk. And these types of selection issues that we've been talking about come up in a really wide range of contexts, actually. Think about the markets for so-called toxic assets following the credit crisis, right? The problem was that the investment banks might know more about how bad they were than people in the market did. And so this made it very hesitant, people hesitant to purchase, and it led to a death spiral that basically shut down a bunch of markets. And as you'll see when we go to see the movie Margin Call, for those of you who are coming, that's what it's all about. It's all about how when somebody becomes aware that there's so much adverse selection. Markets for consumer lending, as we talked about subprime, credit cards, etc. Labor markets. So, for skilled workers, some workers may be much better than others, and they may know that better than the employer knows that. And to the extent that, offering a higher wage attracts in the better workers, there's going to be, basically adverse selection, and there will be too few people employed. There might be unemployment created just because you're trying to attract the best workers, right? So while we focus on focused on the adverse selection issues in these markets, in almost all these markets, especially in insurance, there's a bunch of other issues that are really important. So one is what Ben talked about, not just like I don't know that I should get insurance, but also a ton of people are willing to pay a huge amount more for an insurance brand that they happen to have heard of than another insurance brand that has just as good of a reputation. Or they just stick with whatever insurance they've had in the past, even if there's a new insurance that's like infinitely better, right? So my friend did a study on this, and he basically went through the books of some company, and he found that there were many times when people could have saved $1,000 on their health insurance and gotten exactly the same coverage by switching to a different insurance. But the problem is, there was the deductible and this, there's like 17 different things, and you had to actually do a mathematical analysis of like what you'd pay in every situation to figure out that you were just like giving money away by not being in the other plan, right? And so people couldn't figure it out, so they just stuck with their old plan. And that seems like it could be really problematic But what my friend showed, which is actually quite interesting, is that once people started making more rational decisions, there was a lot of adverse selection. Because the people who were sickest, once they realized what they were doing, would go into the more comprehensive coverage. Whereas if they just stuck with whatever they were doing, there was no adverse selection. So these things can exacerbate the problems, like you were suggesting, Ben, but they can also mitigate the problems in some ways as well. Another huge issue is this short-run versus long-run insurance. So failure to insure against like long-run reclassification risk can actually mean that it's bad to price on the basis of people's risks because that creates all this reclassification risk, right? Another problem is that because you don't have an insurer for long enough, imagine you currently are insured by University of Chicago, but now you're going to go get another job. Now, if you stuck with the University of Chicago as an insurer for the rest of your life, they might, do all sorts of things to, keep you from getting fat, keep you from, doing whatever, things that degrade your long-term health, right? But if you're going to go to a different insurer, they have no incentive to provide those things, right? It's just a cost to them, and another insurer will get the benefit in the future, right? And so that's a major problem as well. Another problem is that there's very little competition in these industries, and that just keeps up prices. On the other hand, monopoly can help solve some of these other problems, right? So if there's only one insurer that you're ever going to have just because it's a monopoly, then they're going to internalize more of these costs, right? And they can help deal with some of the adverse selection problems as well. So this is a constant tension between government provision, private provision, etc. in these industries, is that monopolies have these different costs and benefits, and government versus the private sector has these costs and benefits. And so it's a very interesting area of active policy research. So I'm going to give you guys 5 minutes to fill these out, but I'm also happy to just answer some questions about the midterm or whatever else as you do that.
When are we going to get grades?
You're going to get midterms will be back on Monday, and again, don't pay too much attention to the score because the mean, we don't know exactly in this class, but the mean isn't anywhere above 20. And people who get in the high 20s will get A's almost certainly. So, but you will get a letter grade summarizing the grade for all your work in the course so far. The grade distribution will be generous. I think you'll be happy with it. And
20% or 20 points?
20 out of 100.
So 100 points.
Yeah. And then the midterm also will end up, I think, not counting as much as you might have thought it would, not because I'm downgrading it or anything like that, but just because grades were so compressed. Like on problem sets, some people get 80%, other people get 20%. On this, nobody got above 40%, basically, and nobody got below. Well, I mean, some people got very low, but the point is that the actual difference in the point count is not going to be that great, and so the problem sets I think are going to end up being graded being much more important for you.